Breath of the Wild's identity as a game centers around a single concept: freedom. I'd argue that the game's problems begin here, at the core of its design. See, in video games, the word freedom indicates how you will receive or consume the game's content, yet it fails to express how players will actually interact with that content in a literal and mechanical sense. To illustrate this point, let's imagine a hypothetical game which allows the player complete freedom, meaning absolutely no restrictions on what the player can or can't do. To reach this, the game needs to allow the player access to every possible game state from every other possible game state, with no in-between or prerequisite states. Now that we have no restrictions, our game is completely free and open world. Hopefully you see the problem. We might have complete freedom, but there's nothing to actually do with it. Limitations are what make games interesting, and I think it's fair to say that a game that imposes zero restrictions on the player isn't a game at all. Breath of the Wild obviously limits the player in certain ways. There's gravity, and you can't skip the opening cutscene, but the takeaway is this: freedom as a game vision is inherently flawed. In order for freedom to have meaning, the choices the player can make must have some inherent value. Value is the result of consequences, both positive and negative, and it's what makes games feel satisfying and worth spending our time on. None of us can live forever, and that limitation is what gives time its inherent value. I could be doing anything else right now, so why play video games over other things? My belief is that in order for a game to be good, it needs to follow one basic principle. It must respect the player's time above all else, and by extension, it should value the player's choices and actions. In other words, if your game is bad, it better be really short. Breath of the Wild fails spectacularly in both categories, and I'll explain why. People's time is very valuable, and the developers need to acknowledge that. This can be achieved through high gameplay density, careful pacing, and minimal amounts of tedium, all things that Breath of the Wild is sorely lacking in. It doesn't help that gaming culture's obsession with the idea that a game's length is somehow representative of its monetary value disincentivizes developers to make games with these considerations in mind. At least Breath of the Wild is in good company in this regard. While it promises freedom and subsequently delivers, Breath of the Wild lacks meaningful decisions to make with said freedom, which begs the question of whether or not that freedom was even worth it in the first place. Let's examine a few cases where the game creates an illusion of a decision where one doesn't actually exist. It's worth mentioning that I'm assuming that most people will want to play the game as optimally as they can, since that's typically the goal of games. So while technically speaking, a choice between two alternatives does exist, one is much more favorable and thus invalidates the other. Breath of the Wild's greatest strength is the way that a vast web of possible interactions spring from the combination of a few basic actions. Attacks that were designed for combat can also be used to gather resources or start a fire. Link's ability to hold and drop consumables is essential to cooking, but it can also be used for puzzle solving or sneaking past enemies. Because of this, the player has immense freedom in how they solve certain problems. If the player wants to light a fire, they can use a torch or flammable weapon, strike a piece of flint with a metal weapon, use combustible items such as spicy peppers or red choo-choo jelly, shoot it with fire arrows or a fire rod, or even cause a lightning strike to get the job done. The issue here is that despite the player having a plethora of options at their disposal, it only amounts to having two. Either there is already a fire source nearby and the player does not have to expend resources, or they will have to tap into their stash of fire-starting consumables instead. Depending on which method players choose to execute, it's possible they might be rewarded with novel amusement or the intrinsic satisfaction of problem solving, but the end result remains the same. This decision's effect on the rest of the game is trivial at best, unless the player finds themselves in the unlikely situation where a single fire arrow is the difference between victory or death. Despite the freedom Breath of the Wild allows, the vast majority of its decisions come down to either saving or spending resources, and saving is usually the preferable option. By their very nature, puzzles are in conflict with player freedom, because puzzles are meant to have a small, finite number of solutions, usually only one. Breath of the Wild's various systems allow for different approaches to the same obstacle, and the same is often true with puzzles. Other times there is only one way to progress, such as the Gerudo Town cross-dressing quest, and it arbitrarily restricts players from reaching an area they would otherwise be able to. For this reason, I don't think traditional puzzles are a natural extension of Breath of the Wild's core design philosophy. The designers should have done away with puzzles and instead focused more on obstacles that don't have a prescribed solution, allowing players to take credit for solving their own problems. This philosophy could have made the process of discovering and boarding the divine beasts something unique and special to each individual, as opposed to everyone bottlenecking at a boring fetch quest that will destroy your motivation to replay the game. The path of least resistance guides players to the east of the plateau to visit the 2 villages, where they will then go north to free their first divine beast. Thankfully, there's nothing explicitly forcing you to take this path, but it's sort of a bad idea not to head there early on since you'll be missing out on inventory expansion, rune upgrades, armor upgrades at the fairy fountain, clues to help you find memories, and the signature champion's tunic. The fact that Hestu has a fixed initial placement is perhaps the most atrocious oversight in the entire game. He should have had several different starting locations so that players could have the freedom to explore in whichever direction interested them without missing out on one of the game's most important upgrades. Hyrule Castle is one of the highlights of the game, mostly because it shows what the game could have been had they included more intricate, open-ended dungeons. Unfortunately, between Rivali's Gale and the Zora Tunic, the whole thing is easily skipped, and I'm willing to bet there were quite a few players who did this their first time through. There's still a lot to do in the castle, but it doesn't make for a very climactic final level if you follow the path of least resistance. Weapon durability was undoubtedly a controversial inclusion, but there's nothing inherently wrong with weapons as a finite resource. The real problem stems from the fact that there aren't enough opportunities to spend your weapon uses efficiently. There are a few. For example, elemental weapons can insta-kill enemies of the opposite element, hammers do extra damage to taluses, sneak strikes deal 7 times as much damage, and certain weapons have special utilities such as leaves, torches, and boomerangs. However, there's really no difference between most weapons outside of their damage value. The Zora blade and the Eightfold blade look completely different, but they have no mechanical difference that is relevant to the player in combat. If one dealt extra damage to Lizalfos and the other to Yiga clansmen, there would be a real reason to pick one over the other in certain situations. This would also allow the player a chance to get more value out of their weapon uses and add a whole new dynamic to the game. Similarly, flurry rushes and charge attacks are no more efficient than normal attacks, so it doesn't really matter which one you decide to use. Had charge attacks dealt extra damage, it would have incentivized players to use them and rewarded good use of stamina. These aren't perfect solutions, but they would make using your weapons feel satisfying instead of draining. In Master Mode, all enemies are bumped up to the next color rank, from red to blue to black to silver to gold, meaning they get a substantial increase in health and attack power. On top of this, enemies are also capable of regenerating up to 30% of their health if not attacked for a few seconds. This does make the game more difficult, but it also greatly limits the player's strategic options during combat. Players are actively punished for using crowd control tactics, and their best option becomes focusing on one enemy at a time to avoid wasting weapon uses. Things in the environment such as fire, boulders, and explosive barrels become almost entirely useless against enemies, shutting off the most interesting part of Breath of the Wild's combat. Lizalfos are particularly frustrating to fight in Master Mode because they love to run away from Link. This applies to bosses as well, including Ganon, who can become invincible and camp the player, healing while doing so. Whatever challenge there might have been in Breath of the Wild's combat is offset by the fact that the player can pause at any time and gain access to basically infinite healing. Why the game ended up like this is a mystery, because this problem has already been solved decades ago by many other games, including previous entries in the Zelda series. They should have either limited the amount of available healing items, put some kind of time penalty on eating, or both. It's possible that this was a way to artificially make the game easier, or to counteract the enemies being overtuned, but it doesn't change the fact that this system makes combat encounters less engaging and much less satisfying. The Flurry Rush mechanic also doesn't do the game any favors. On top of being awkwardly slow and pace-breaking, the conditions for triggering it are hazy, and it can occasionally cause you to get hit. Implementation flaws aside, the Flurry Rush as a concept makes no sense. Is this Bayonetta or something? There's no need to worry about positioning because you can always get a free opening, so it doesn't really matter what the enemies are doing so long as you memorize the dodge timing. Parrying is already designed to do this, except it's harder to perform and less rewarding, and therefore gets overshadowed in most cases. The Flurry Rush hits automatically track the opponent, the polar opposite of freedom, so it's hard for players to take credit for connecting them. Linos were intended to satisfy those who are looking for a challenge, and on the surface they appeared to deliver. However, once you figure out the least resource-intensive way to beat them, they become nothing more than repetitive parry minigames. When a Lionel is stunned, Link can hop on its back and get 5 free hits. The problem arises from the fact that these hits don't degrade your weapons at all, so using this attack supersedes all other tactics unless you're willing to part with your precious resources. Here I was able to defeat a silver Lionel without expending a single point of weapon durability, and the arrows I used can be easily replaced. Lionels were almost a really cool and much needed test of skill for the game, but as it is, they are yet another way to waste time in Breath of the Wild. At some point after obtaining the initial 4 runes, the realization kicks in that you won't be finding anything this special ever again for the rest of the game. Now all you have to look forward to in shrines are spirit orbs, 4 of which will grant the player a choice between an additional heart or more stamina. These options seem balanced at first glance, but they aren't. The amount of stamina Link's actions cost stays the same across the entire game, but the amount of damage enemies deal doesn't. Because weapons have the same attack value regardless of who uses them, enemies are given a flat damage increase based on their color, and they will start doing ridiculous amounts of damage in relation to Link's health if he doesn't have the armor to compensate. There is a mechanic that prevents you from being killed in a single hit from full health, but this is only a band-aid solution and comes with its own problems. Say Link is hit by an attack that does 5 hearts of damage, but only has 3 hearts. He will survive with the quarter heart and must be hit a second time in order to die. Let's then suppose that the player then finds and completes 12 shrines, watches at least 24 loading screens, and dumps those 12 spirit orbs into Link's health, giving him a total of 6 hearts. Now, if Link is again hit by an attack that does 5 hearts of damage, he will survive with 1 full heart remaining, and must be hit a second time in order to actually die. It makes no difference in this case whether the player has 3 or 6 hearts, the outcome is the same. This massively devalues extra hearts, and by extension completing shrines, as the player can just heal up to full and tank another hit anyway. It's worth noting that the one-shot protection is not in master mode, but proper game balance shouldn't be locked behind a DLC paywall. In order to have any kind of impact on Link's survival, the player would need to have at least 11 hearts, meaning 20 more shrines, 40 more loading screens, and hours of gameplay just to be able to survive a single extra hit. This is why I assume most people invested in stamina instead, as it has significantly more utility for the vast majority of the game. Spirit orbs can be reassigned at the demon statue anyway, so your choice of how to spend them doesn't matter as much as it seems. Players have the choice to spend their Korok seeds on additional weapon, bow, or shield slots. However, one of the 3 is far more valuable than the others. The only reason to invest in bow or shield slots is when weapon slots start costing 25 times as much, and the perceived value of each Korok seed becomes abysmally low. Bows don't break nearly as often as melee weapons, and 2 of the 3 weapon types won't even let you use a shield unless you put them away first, which mainly hurts less experienced players who have difficulty managing their stance during combat. The main benefit to upgrading weapon slots is that it gives you more potential damage output, which will allow you to take on the bigger damage sponges the game likes to throw at you. It also gives you more room to hoard the champion weapons you'll never use. Breath of the Wild handles horses pretty well overall, but it's disappointing that horse teleportation is exclusive to the DLC's ancient horse armor. Cosmetic items need to be balanced just as much as functional ones do. Perhaps the most blatant disregard for game balance can be found in the DLC armor sets. The Phantom set grants Link increased strength even more than the Barbarian set in the base game does. The difference is that, to get the Barbarian set, the player must complete each of the 3 labyrinths located at the corners of the map, not to mention the fact that it's one of the most difficult sets to upgrade, requiring all 3 types of dragon scales. In contrast, the Phantom set is all but handed to the player for free as long as you've purchased the DLC. How Nintendo can willingly ruin their own armor balancing like this makes no sense. Why go through the trouble of designing Kilton and his hot air balloon shop if you're just gonna give me Majora's Mask, which has the effect of all his enemy masks combined, so that I never need to speak with him in the first place? The worst part is that Majora's Mask is literally on the way from the Great Plateau to Hyrule Castle, so you can just grab it on your way there and completely ignore all the enemies. Yet another way to skip the game's hardest area with zero skill involved. Clearly the devs either weren't communicating or were too busy swimming in their piles of money to care. These are all instances where, due to poor game balancing, implementation issues, or any combination of other factors, the balance between the choices the player has was compromised, causing the decision itself to lose its meaning. In many cases, a mistake in one part of the game actually ended up being the cause of more problems in other parts of the game. I like to think of these different parts as the game's systems. I'm not speaking solely about literal systems at the software level, but also about the different facets of Breath of the Wild's game design and how they interact with one another. For example, weapons and their attributes such as damage output and durability make up a system, enemy behavior makes up its own system, item prices at shops make up their own system, the different climbable surfaces and the resource taxes required to climb them make up their own system, and so on. The various systems in Breath of the Wild are not self-contained units. They are constantly acting on and reacting to each other in real time. For a game that lives or dies on the interplay between its systems, these issues can compound to have catastrophic effects. Breath of the Wild seems to suffer from this type of domino effect effect to a greater degree than most other games, largely because of its massive scope and sandbox nature. The designers spent their development cycle blindly chasing the concept of player freedom without understanding the kind of careful balance such freedom would demand. The more time you spend playing Breath of the Wild and the deeper you analyze it, the closer it comes to our little absolute freedom experiment. Your choices don't have the same weight that you initially thought they had, and your interactions with the game start to feel more and more meaningless as a result. Why do anything except defeat Ganon? Why even do that? But wait, don't all games boil down to a series of right and wrong answers? Since we are finite beings, which is the reason why we enjoy cycles of conflict and payoff so much, we don't need a game to be mathematically perfect. But we aren't so finite that Breath of the Wild is a complex game to us by any means. I'm not going to talk as much about Breath of the Wild's story because I think it's the most inconsequential part of the game. It's not going to make or break the experience for you, which works in the game's favor because it's one of its worst aspects. That said, I will highlight a few specific areas where it suffers the most. The Sheikah originated in Ocarina of Time as a tribe of assassins, so by repurposing them as inventors and scientists, the team is asking us to make quite a large logical leap already. They are the ones responsible for all the new technology in Hyrule, including guardians, shrines, the divine beasts, beam swords, Link's smartphone, the motorcycle, and virtually everything else. The developers use this as a catch-all solution to anything they can't or don't want to explain. It would have served the game well had they not spent so much time leaning on this crutch, as it would have opened up plenty of opportunities to give the world a meaningful history. I have no problem with the fact that the divine beasts were each built in the form of some kind of animal, but it makes absolutely no sense why one is an elephant and another is a camel. To my knowledge, these animals have never appeared in a Zelda game and shouldn't exist in Hyrule. It would have made much more sense from a world-building perspective if they had been a frog and a seal instead, since those creatures actually exist in their respective regions. Most people are probably willing to ignore this oversight, but I believe that the designers of a game should care about it just as much, if not more, than its most dedicated fans. The fact that Nintendo resorted to the cliché of having a camel in a desert area with no real explanation shows how little they actually care about making a serious game, and I don't think players should be expected to take it seriously either. Link has, for the most part, always been a silent protagonist, so that we as players can become him and thus increase our perceived immersion. This trend continues with Breath of the Wild, only this time Link has a definite identity. He is already a hero, having proven himself worthy to guard the princess and become leader of the champions, and the game takes every opportunity to remind you of his legendary deeds. Because of this, we can't identify as him in the same way as we could in past Zelda titles, and we lose out on the experience of becoming a legend through his eyes. Most of the other characters get their screen time through one-on-one interactions with Link. The champion cutscenes are particularly awkward, not only because of their lackluster voice work, but mainly because of the fact that almost all of them consist of another character monologuing at Link, since he isn't allowed to respond. The four champions do not have enough personality to make these one-sided conversations work. They're really just marketing icons that have no relevance other than the fact that they give Link much-needed new abilities. Not that the descendants are any better, but it's a shame to see them get overshadowed by their ancestors, given that they're the ones who are actually still living. It's hard to feel like a hero when the world doesn't seem all that in need of saving, and Breath of the Wild's Hyrule is just that. You sort of just assume something bad will happen if you can't stop Ganon, but the game doesn't really show anything to convince you of that outside of some ruins here and there. They even use the same currency they always have, so the castle and its surrounding towns must not have been all that essential to Hyrule's economy in the first place. Ocarina of Time did a fantastic job with this back in the day. Seeing the once bustling town square reduced to a pile of rubble and zombies really sells the idea that the world needs your presence, and that your actions will actually have an impact on the things in-game from a narrative perspective. I've demonstrated that Breath of the Wild lacks enough substance to make the player's time and actions meaningful, but there is a catch to this which the game capitalizes on heavily. The modern AAA paradigm is more or less built on the assumption that the first time you play a game, you will have no way of knowing what it has in store for you outside of whatever trailers or advertisements may exist. There are plenty of exceptions to this, but even still, the truth is Breath of the Wild relies heavily on the player's expectation of meaningful content to come. Breath of the Wild takes advantage of the player's expectations to keep them playing through repetitive and mundane sections, allowing them to stretch out the game's content and lengthen the overall playtime. Traversing the overworld is a perfect example of this, as it's often uneventful and repetitive. The novelty of climbing, gliding, and repeatedly using cryonists to cross a body of water only lasts for so long, especially on repeat playthroughs after you've gotten the lay of the land and aren't stumbling upon new and interesting locations. Fast travel was included to prevent this from becoming an issue, but even fast travel isn't exactly fast. Instead, it's the equivalent of not getting to play for 20 seconds, worsened by the fact that the teleporting animation can't be sped up or skipped. Small time sinks like this actually work in the developer's favor, since the market encourages greater game length, the polar opposite of how the arcade business model led to shorter, more difficult games. Breath of the Wild does allow players to traverse the world more quickly using stasis or wind bombing, but setting up a stasis launch is highly situational and often not worth the trouble, and wind bombing comes at the cost of your health, on top of being unintended tech that the vast majority of players will never use. Shrines and Korok puzzles are similarly repetitive and predictable. Regardless of the actual challenge, the reward is always the same. Hopefully I was able to articulate why these rewards aren't proportionate to the time spent pursuing them, so I don't consider these rewards a good enough justification for completing these challenges. It's also important to note that Korok puzzles come in the same 10 or so varieties, and that a sixth of the overall number of shrines are tests of strength. So if you don't like the Guardian Scout fight, then you're out of luck. There's a lot of recycled content which wasn't that fun to engage with in the first place. Speaking of content, the challenges themselves are incredibly basic. Here are some examples. Get a ball through a 3D rotating maze. Follow behind a kid without him noticing. Fill in the missing object. Take a picture of one shrine and use its code in the other. Fly through the rings. Glide as far as you can. Cook food that helps some bird kid remember a password. Shoot targets. Talk to an NPC that has Sun in their name. Collect wood. Repeat. Put the block where it's supposed to go. Pick up a suspicious rock. Spot the difference between two things. Burn leaves. Go through a maze. Investigate a sparkling spot on the ground. Besides traversal and combat, this is Breath of the Wild's quote-unquote content. The same kind of content you'll find in a kid's activity book. If one of these challenges was a game on its own, no one would care. But because they're all part of the same game, suddenly it's the greatest game of all time. It makes absolutely no sense how people are so willing to slog through all these surface-level minigames for a fraction of a reward that won't end up making a difference since the game lacks any kind of real in-game challenge to work towards. The only difference between Dark Beast Ganon and the horseback archery course is that the archery course has a time limit. There's another important factor that ties into this discussion of player expectations in Breath of the Wild, and it's something that has been detrimental from day one of development. Breath of the Wild is a Zelda game, and I don't think that was a good thing for the game itself. First, let's cover the obvious advantages being a Zelda game has. Breath of the Wild ended a 6-year drought in one of Nintendo's most beloved franchises, meaning that fans had been anticipating it several years in advance, and wanted to be blown away. Because Zelda is a well-established franchise, the gaming market was much more receptive to Breath of the Wild, given it had a pre-existing fanbase and strong pedigree. The game received tons of press and had a huge presence at E3 2016, and would continue to get media coverage well after launch. The game's review scores were consistently high, and virtually every gaming news outlet was on board, so it was set up for success from the very start. Another unique advantage to being a Zelda game is that Breath of the Wild was able to take advantage of a very strange phenomenon that I have observed in Zelda series discussion. Despite the series' wide appeal, discussion around Zelda is relatively self-contained, and for whatever reason, people tend to only compare Zelda games with their fellow Zelda games. This is of huge benefit to Breath of the Wild, as its focus on providing a less restrictive gameplay experience addressed complaints that the series' formula was growing stale and elevated it among its peers. Even today, I believe that this Zelda bubble prevents the game from getting the criticism it deserves, which is necessary if we want to have better installments going forward. The Zelda brand certainly helped Breath of the Wild as a product, but what about as a game, the part that we as players should care about? Zelda's massive fanbase presented one main challenge to the design team. In order for the game to have wide appeal, it must appeal to a wide variety of different players, each with their own tastes and skill levels. This means they had to make a number of concessions, particularly in regards to difficulty. Zelda used to be considered one of Nintendo's hardcore IPs, but after Wind Waker's decisive push to include a younger demographic, each subsequent game has been less challenging and more restrictive than the last, until Breath of the Wild. Giving players complete freedom to walk in any direction they choose must have been terrifying for Nintendo, as there is a lot less they can do to protect players from having a bad experience. To compensate, the game was given a relatively flat difficulty curve, and no matter where you go, you will always encounter more or less the same obstacles and rewards. While it does come at the cost of less overall demand in the short term, limiting the target audience would allow designers to make the game more engaging and fulfilling for those that do play it. We've seen this kind of design pay off with the Souls series. What was once a relatively obscure franchise is now part of the mainstream thanks to its passionate and vocal fanbase. I believe the key to making a truly great game is accepting the possibility that not everyone will like it, and designing it to be the best it can be for one specific audience. Trying to cater to all types of players ultimately means you'll end up alienating some of them, and had they decided to serve a particular audience particularly well, they could have pushed the game's difficulty and crafted much more interesting levels to interact with. They did this with Majora's Mask, which, while significantly less approachable than its predecessor due to its time limit and overall darker tone, is perhaps the most unique and interesting take on the series to date. Breath of the Wild's restructuring of the Zelda formula could have been much more divisive if the developers had taken their idea and run with it, but they took the safe option instead, and from a business perspective I can't say I blame them. However, the artistic result was a painfully mediocre experience, and I feel less inclined to play the game when I know that there are others that will give me the same kind of gameplay better and faster. For what it's worth, Zelda was never really Nintendo's big cash cow like Mario or Pokemon. The games were always incredibly popular, yet I never felt that Zelda projects received the same amount of resources after Ocarina of Time. Is it any surprise then that Breath of the Wild is an unfinished game, if the last 3 console installments before it were also unfinished, going off their number of dungeons? Tears of the Kingdom might just be the first fully finished console Zelda in over 2 decades. We'll see. When your franchise is as revered and accepted as Zelda, how do you go about reinventing it? The short answer is, you don't. There was a limit to how much change corporate Nintendo would allow, given that Breath of the Wild was a big budget game meant to sell a brand new console. Some fans have complained that Breath of the Wild was too big a departure from Zelda tradition, but the reality is that it didn't change enough. Breath of the Wild is more concerned with being a Zelda game than being the best game it can be, which has kept the game from realizing the potential of its ideas. One common critique of this game is its lack of traditional dungeons, but if it weren't a Zelda game, no one would be saying this. Rather than battling against people's preconceived notions of what a Zelda game is, Nintendo decided it was much easier to give in and add elements from past games even though they really don't belong. They were bold enough to cut dungeons and items, but they couldn't cut puzzles, even though they work against the design vision, because puzzles have become synonymous with Zelda at this point. Shrine puzzles do a good job of highlighting the intricacies of the game's physics system, but they fit so poorly with the main game that many of them had to be confined in a completely disconnected space from the rest of the world. A far better alternative would have been to make navigating Hyrule itself the puzzle, so that problem-solving elements can emerge naturally in a way that is directly relevant to the player. Korok puzzles are a sorry attempt at this, as they are equally irrelevant to the player's forward progression, and only serve to pad out the experience with unnecessary distractions. Races like the Gorons, Zora, Rito, and Koroks are more examples of recycled material, and as a result, they lack the sense of belonging they once had when they were first introduced. Ganon doesn't even have a backstory this time, he's just a big purple cloud that we assume must be the villain since that's how the previous games worked. I'd go as far as to say that the game would have been better if the Zelda license had been dropped, and a new franchise was created from the ground up without any baggage or prior expectations. This would have opened up the designers to realize their gameplay vision and create a theme and narrative to complement it, which could have led to a better experience for everyone involved. Though the sad reality is that from Nintendo's perspective, Breath of the Wild needed to be a Zelda game so that the game and the Switch could reach the sales numbers they did. Before we close out, I want to address a few potential counter-arguments to the claims I've made here. The first is this. Can you really complain about the game after having played it for nearly 200 hours? Isn't it hypocritical to bash it even though you've already gotten your money's worth? To that I say, that's some backwards logic. Would you trust a film critic who only watched part of the movie, or only watched it once? The whole point of critics is for them to have more informed and developed opinions on a subject than the average consumer, and I think playing and analyzing a game is the best way to form a solid opinion on it. I certainly enjoyed Breath of the Wild back when it came out, but my gaming tastes were much less developed compared to what they are now. But even if I enjoyed a game for 1,000 hours, only to tell you that it's garbage, would that make it a good game? My answer is no. Games are not just consumable goods that give you a set amount of entertainment. They serve an artistic purpose and can provide a much deeper level of satisfaction than any other media. I don't view games as a source of short-term amusement that need to be regularly replaced, but rather like classical music, which can be appreciated for all time. I've also seen people saying that we need to stop hating on Nintendo, and that they are undeserving of harsh criticisms. However, I don't think these people understand the situation. Nintendo isn't an individual, it's a company that is too big to care about my feelings, or anyone's so long as it's not causing them to lose profits. If you believe that a company like Nintendo always has your best interests in mind, then I have bad news for you. As lighthearted and approachable as their games may be, in reality they still have to make cold-blooded business decisions. Their focus is and will always be on making enough money to sustain and grow the company, not on making the best possible games. I realize that making a game of this scale is extraordinarily difficult, and I've tried to separate the design team from the executives where applicable, but no one should feel bad critiquing Breath of the Wild despite all the people behind it, because I don't think going easy on developers will lead to better designed games in the future. Besides, I've given Nintendo hundreds of dollars at this point, so it only makes sense that I'm concerned with where my money is going. So, is Breath of the Wild a bad video game? In order to determine that, we would first need to define what a bad video game actually is, and I don't think that is possible to do. The artistic value of a game is not something we can measure. Each person develops their own opinion of a game based on their interactions with it and what they hear about it from others. Even if all of humanity agreed that a certain game was bad, that wouldn't mean it's truly a bad game, because it is impossible to say anything objective about artistic expression. Any claim I make is in relation to my own subjective opinion, and while I can support my claim with bits and pieces of objectivity, it's impossible to quantify it as fact because it takes my specific perspective to tie those pieces together. That being said, our opinions will differ, even if you think you agree with me, and it's better for society that it stays that way. However, there's still a problem. Calling Breath of the Wild the best game of all time is also a subjective claim, but the more it gets repeated, the more people will actually believe that it is the absolute best that games have to offer, and shut themselves off from much more satisfying and personally meaningful gaming experiences. I have a theory that people want a repeat of the Ocarina of Time phenomenon, which many also lauded as an all-time great, an attempt to reach a state of like-minded admiration for a specific title. Breath of the Wild has probably had a comparable level of impact on pop culture, but if societal impact is the metric, then what about games like Tetris? If Breath of the Wild is the best game of all time, we're in trouble, and if that's what a good game looks like, then we can expect more mediocre games in the future. I think we should be raising our standards for game design to encourage developers to make better games. The quote-unquote best game of all time likely doesn't exist yet, and if we stay stuck on the hype train, we may never find it.